The largest prison system in the Western industrialized world can be found in just one state, California. It's 40% larger than the entire federal prison system, and it houses more inmates than do the countries of France, Great Britain, Germany, Japan, Singapore, and the Netherlands combined. The raw material for our prison system, it's inmates, the poor, the homeless, drug dealers, drug addicts, and alcoholics. You know the best way to determine who will end in prison? Literacy. 70% of all inmates in the United States are illiterate. So where do these people come from? The answer, of course, is everywhere. But if you look more closely, a significant and disproportionate amount come from neighborhoods like mine. 8 years ago, my wife and I moved into an inner city community in South Dallas called Banton. Banton is a predominantly African-American neighborhood that was established soon after slavery ended. And from that day until now, Banton has been separated from the rest of the city. More recently, a highway and a railroad have further isolated us, making Banton also a desert of sorts. So what happens when entire communities of people are separated from the structural resources that we as human beings use to build our lives with, like food and jobs? Well, in Banton, it looks like this. About half our men will go to prison before their 25th birthday. We graduate a little more than half of our kids from high school, and we suffer from more than double the rate of cancer and stroke and heart disease and diabetes and childhood obesity than the county that we're in. I first went to Banton because I got invited to a meeting with a group of men from the neighborhood that were returning home from prison trying not to go back. And those men changed my life. When people ask me why I moved there, I often just say that sometimes you see things that you can't unsee. And those men gave me that gift. It was funny, when we first moved in, so many people came over to meet us, and I thought, this is the friendliest community in the world. Nobody ever came to meet us like that when we moved into the suburbs. Now, I later learned it was a bet on what branch of law enforcement I worked with, so those meetings were a little more like an interrogation than neighborly meetings, but I got to meet a lot of people nonetheless. And at the end of each of those conversations, I would always say the same thing. Look, I'm just here to try to be a good neighbor and to learn, but if there's something I could do to help, what would it be? And every single person I met said the same thing: jobs. Now, most of the people I met didn't have resumes or even the experience to put on a resume if they had one. So we set out to do something about it. We decided that we would start helping clean up our neighborhood and that we'd help serve the neighbors in need. And we would use that experience to build resumes so that we could get jobs elsewhere. And almost immediately, we hit a snag. Our neighbors started calling in sick. And I'm like, you can't do that. If you really want a job, you have to show up. And I learned a really important lesson then, that you see things differently when you live somewhere than when you just visit. You see, my new neighbors weren't sick like I was accustomed to. This wasn't from a cold or the flu. They were really sick. In fact, my friend Darius came to me one day and he said, you know, I really want to participate in this program. I love what you're doing, but I'll never be able to come on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. And I just laughed and said, well, I guess you really don't want to work then. And he looked back at me with this look of hopelessness that I'll never forget. And he said, my kidneys don't work. I have dialysis on those days, and it's the only thing keeping me alive. And so I started asking the question, why are so many of my new neighbors so sick? This isn't normal. And the answer I got floored me. They told me that Banton was a food desert, that the only food we had access to is what they sell in the liquor stores. And so in 2019, in Dallas, Texas, one of the richest cities in the world, we have entire communities of people that are sick and dying because they don't have access to food. How can that be? Well, once again, we decided to do something about it. This time, we set out and started an urban farm, and not long after, we opened a neighborhood market and cafe. And we used the farm to grow food, but we also use it to create paid internships, so people looking to get their life on track have a place to come and work and build a resume to get jobs elsewhere. And we also use it to create jobs. And so far, I'm really proud that we've been able to create over 30 full-time jobs through these efforts. We've run into other problems along the way, too. I mean, everything that we need, the goods and services, and even the jobs, are in other places. So transportation's been a challenge. And maybe the biggest obstacle we've faced is safe, affordable housing. Where do people stay while they're doing the hard work of getting their life on track and starting their first job? And as these problems begin to pile up, it's easy to start to feel a bit hopeless, like the problems are just too big and too complex. I know I've felt that way before. That is until one day at the farm, we had a really hard job to do. You see, I had 2 tractor trailer loads of compost delivered, and it rained for 3 days. And we were going to have to do the hard job of taking that now smelly compost, wet and smelly compost, a shovel load at a time into wheelbarrows, wheeling it into the garden and putting it out into the rows. And I didn't want our team doing that without understanding why. So I gathered everybody around and I handed out packets of seeds and I said, look, everything that we grew all year, it took things from the soil to grow. That food didn't come without a cost. And if we don't replace it, our soil will soon be bankrupt. And so we're going to do this, and when we're done, we're going to take those seeds you have in your hand, and we're going to plant them in that good soil. And before long, those seeds will look like the picture on the packet you took it out of. And one of the interns looked at me, and she said, your seeds are dead. I'm like, why do you got to talk about my seeds like that? What's wrong with my seeds? And she said, no, they're shriveled up and dry. That's what dead things look like. And I said, well, that may be true, but it's not so with these seeds. If you take these seeds and you put them in good soil, and you position them where the sun passes overhead, and you give them the right amount of water, these seeds will almost assuredly become what they were created to be. And she looked back at me with tears welling up in her eyes, and she said, then we're just like those seeds. Now, I'm a dude, so I think we're still talking about dirt. I have no idea what's going on. So I asked her to explain. I said, I'm sorry, I'm not tracking. And she said, well, I grew up here in this place in Banton. What were we supposed to grab a hold of to build a life with? What was our sun, soil, and water? And I started to understand what she was saying. What she was trying to say is that we as people need certain things to build a life with. And when those things are not present, our lives become something perverted and smaller than what they could be. And so it started a conversation in our neighborhood about what are sun, soil, and water to people. And the good news is, it turns out we're not that much more complicated than seeds. In fact, we think there's 7 things. We've talked about some of them already. Jobs or economic development, food or health and wellness, transportation, safe, affordable housing, community building, education, and access to fair credit. And here's the big idea. My neighborhood thinks that when those 7 things are present, that our community will use those things to build lives with. Now, that might not sound like a big idea to you, but think about it. Think of the thousands of lives that will not be in prison, that will not be sick in our county hospitals, that will not be on a cot in our homeless shelters, and not be strung out on dope in the streets, but instead use these things to build productive, contributing lives, giving back to their communities and their cities. And here's the big thing. Banton's not unique. There are thousands of Bantons across the country, and if it can happen in our neighborhood, it can happen anywhere. From the beginning of time, we've had vulnerable people among us, and we know it brings out the opportunity for the absolute worst kinds of evil and the most heroic good. In fact, Isaac Franklin and James Armfield are not known names, nor should they be. But their names are written in the history of slavery in this country as the ones that took selling human beings and made it a modern and organized business. And the atrocities they committed along the way are unspeakable. And on the other hand, the heroic good of Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, whose name we should know and revere, who risked her life over and over and over and over again to lead hundreds of slaves to freedom. And so here we are at a fork in the road ourselves, with the opportunity to determine where our names and our generation will be written in history. Let's be on the side of heroic good, and let's determine together once and for all to get the root cause of the issues in our communities so that the people that call those places home have the resources they need to build a life with in the first place. Thank you.